Hello and welcome to week 10 of Rehab Counseling 620 Vocational Evaluation and Work Adjustment. This is Gary M. Cusick, PhD, CRC, PVE. This class will focus on personality assessment and vocational rehabilitation. Personality assessment. Personality plays a role in career decision making, job performance, occupational strengths, and job satisfaction. Assessment aids in identification of strengths and deficits that influence jobs and where the consumer may function effectively now and where training is needed. The focus should be on behaviors necessary for employment and adequate productivity. One of the goals of rehabilitation is to assist the consumer find work that fits them as a person. Personality assessment helps to fine-tune this match between the person and the job. Personality in this sense refers to preferences, temperaments, proclivity, and not personality as it relates to pathology, as in personality disorders. Vocational personality. Beginning at a young age, exposure to various types of work, work experiences, and personal motivation develops into a stable trait. Traits are observable, stable, enduring, and contribute significantly to consumers' behavior. States are less stable characteristics and transitory exhibition of a personality trait and is a temporary predisposition. In terms of employment, the consumer's behavior by way of personality will determine whether they are successful or not. There are behaviors that you want to increase and there are behaviors that you want to decrease. Behaviors that you might want to increase would include things like level of activity, asking for work, problem solving, and appropriate communication with coworkers. Behavior that you might want to decrease could include daydreaming, off-work behavior, unauthorized internet activity, or substance abuse. Personality is a trait, or more accurately, a collection of traits that can be expressed as a vocational personality. Vocational personality has its beginning in experience that the person has in school, observations of role models, and opportunities to try out different things. If the person doesn't have mobility as a result of a disability, they have fewer experiences, fewer opportunities to try out new things, and as a result, are less likely to have developed an effective vocational personality. Such a person may have a very shallow understanding of work due to limited opportunities, and the vocational rehabilitation counselor must try to play catch-up with the consumer to their same age peers. Vocational functioning. It's comprised of both traits and states. An assessment of vocational functioning is a positive, strength-based understanding of behaviors. And it includes the consumer's emotional adjustment to disability as seen in the Kubler-Ross stages, which include denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Adjustment to disability is often thought of as being dichotomous. There are persons who are born with a disability and there are persons who have an acquired disability. It may be thought that persons born with a disability have reached an adjustment to it, but this is not always correct. The person born with a disability or the person who's had a disability for most of their life will be continually adjusting to it as different stages of their life develop. The most obvious development would be the transitional consumer moving from high school to the world of work. The student who is able to successfully manage academic tasks without the need for cooperation from others, however, will need to fit in with coworkers at the workplace. The meaning of disability to the consumer will also change throughout their lives. Depending on the nature of the disability, the consumer may be successful at early stages, such as obtaining entry-level work, but may have difficulty getting additional training or other higher-paying jobs or promotions. The course of the disability may also mean that the person will have to miss work for doctor's appointments, have setbacks, and perhaps leave the workforce earlier than most others. Collecting information on personality functioning. Usually a psychologist administers a battery of tests and develops a report to be given to the referring agency. Reports contain information not vocationally relevant, or they don't address the residual emotional strengths used for vocational training or employment. How much vocationally relevant information is obtained in the personality evaluation will depend on the psychologist doing the evaluation. The psychologist will provide the routine report that they are used to doing for schools or the courts, which does not usually address vocational questions. Having written questions you wish to have answered at the time of the referral will make it more likely that you will get the information that will bear directly on the consumer's ability to work. Issues to consider when collecting personality information. Personality questionnaires use the self-report method. Consumers could avoid revealing themselves and distort their responses in a particular direction. Consumers wishing to project a certain image may give socially desirable responses. Research literature, however, suggests that self-report does not always result in a loss of reliability or validity. In any testing situation, it's important for the evaluator to put the consumer at ease. The development of rapport and the explanation of the use of personality testing will result in a personality profile that's less likely to be defensive. Almost all personality inventories include a validity element that can be used to determine if the profile obtained is accurate. Many employers are now giving tests in which the applicants reveal something of their personality through a series of questions. These questions seem to function very much like those on personality inventories. They also include validity elements such as asking the consumer the same question worded differently to catch faking. Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory 2, or MMPI-2. Versions of the MMPI-2. MMPI-2 has 567 true and false questions. The MMPI-2RF has 338 true and false questions. Both are written at the 6th grade level and may take between 1 and 2 hours. Raw scores are converted to T-scores, with 65 usually being the cut score. Consumers taking this test for me have generally been compliant, even taking the 567 version of the test. The 338 item revised format can be administered more quickly, however, and yields adequate information for the clinician. Care should be taken that the consumer understands the question. A professionally recorded version of the test is available for those who have difficulty reading due to disability. Questions are worded in both positive and negative directions. Positively worded questions would be something like, "I know when I'm sick enough to see the doctor," versus, "I never know when to see the doctor when I'm sick." There are at least 150 scales that are used with the 567 item MMPI-2. The MMPI-2 revised format has 51 scales. The items of the MMPI are empirically derived. This means that the items have been found to be predictive of membership in a particular group, even though the question itself does not appear to be doing that. So many of the items do not have face validity. This is a strength for different reasons. The first is that the consumer doesn't know what the intent of the question is when they answer it, which means they are not as likely to tip their answers toward or away from a particular disorder. The most important, however, is that persons with a particular disorder answer a series of questions in a particular way. MMPI-2 clinical scales. 1. Hypochondriasis. 2. Depression. 3. Hysteria. 4. Psychopathic deviant. 5. Masculinity, femininity. 6. Paranoia. 7. Psychasthenia. 8. Schizophrenia. 9. Hypomania. 0. Social introversion. The MMPI has 10 clinical scales that are used to indicate different psychological conditions. Despite the names being given to each scale, they are not a pure measure since many conditions have overlapping symptoms. Because of this, most psychologists simply refer to each scale by number. Scale 1, hypochondriasis. This scale was originally designed to assess a neurotic concern over bodily functioning. The 32 items on this scale concern somatic symptoms and physical well-being. The scale was originally developed to identify patients displaying the symptoms of hypochondria. Scale 2, depression. The scale was originally designed to identify depression characterized by poor morale, lack of hope in the future, and general dissatisfaction with one's life situation. Very high scores may indicate depression, while moderate scores tend to reveal a general dissatisfaction with one's life. Scale 3, hysteria. The third scale was originally designed to identify those who display hysteria in stressful situations. Those who are well educated and of a high social class tend to score higher on this scale. Women also tend to score higher than men on this scale. Scale 4, psychopathic deviant. Originally developed to identify psychopathic patients, this scale measures social deviation, lack of acceptance of authority, and amorality. This scale can be thought of as a measure of disobedience. High scorers tend to be more rebellious, while low scorers tend to be more accepting of authority. Despite the name of this scale, high scorers are usually diagnosed with a personality disorder rather than a psychotic disorder. Scale 5, masculinity-femininity. This scale was designed by the original authors to identify homosexual tendencies, but was found to be largely ineffective. High scores on this scale are related to such factors as intelligence, socioeconomic status, and education. Women tend to score low on this scale. Scale 6, paranoia. This scale was originally developed to identify patients with paranoid symptoms, such as suspiciousness, feelings of persecution, grandiose self-concepts, excessive sensitivity, and rigid attitudes. Those who score high on this scale tend to have paranoid symptoms. Scale 7, psychasthenia. This diagnostic label is no longer used today, and the symptoms described on this scale are more reflective of obsessive-compulsive disorder. This scale was originally used to measure excessive doubts, compulsions, obsessions, and unreasonable fears. Scale 8, schizophrenia. This scale was originally developed to identify schizophrenic patients and reflects a wide variety of areas, including bizarre thought processes and peculiar perceptions, social alienation, poor family relationships, difficulties in concentration and impulse control, lack of deep interests, disturbing questions of self-worth and self-identity, and sexual difficulties. This scale is considered difficult to interpret. Scale 9, hypomania. This scale was developed to identify characteristics of hypomania such as elevated mood, accelerated speech and motor activity, irritability, flight of ideas, and brief periods of depression. Scale 0, social introversion. This scale was developed later than the other 9 scales and is designed to assess a person's tendency to withdraw from social contacts and responsibilities. Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory 2, revised format, also known as the MMPI-2-RF. The MMPI-2-RF assesses the same areas of psychological functioning as the MMPI-2. Scales provide information on individual test takers' clinical symptoms, personality characteristics, behavioral tendencies, interpersonal functioning, and interests, as well as on threats to validity of the test itself. Users must have graduate-level training in psychological testing and assessment and be familiar with the means by which basic psychometric functions of test scores such as reliability, measurement error, validity, classification statistics, and accuracy analysis, norms, and the derivation of standard scores are evaluated. Validity indicators. Variable response inconsistency, or random responding. True response inconsistency, fixed responding. Infrequent responses, responses infrequent in the general population. Infrequent psychopathology responses, responses infrequent in psychiatric populations. Infrequent somatic responses, somatic complaints infrequent in medical patient populations. Symptom validity, somatic and cognitive complaints associated at high levels with over-reporting. Response bias scale, exaggerated memory complaints. uncommon virtues, rarely claimed moral attributes or activities. Adjustment validity, avowals of a good psychological adjustment at high levels with underreporting. Interpretation of the MMPI-2 RF begins with inspection of the validity scales to determine if the test results are interpretable, and if so, whether any interpretive caveats are called for. Each of these scales above addresses specific concerns about protocol validity, possible reasons for this, and implications for interpretation of the protocol are described at different score levels. The scores for the validity scales indicate how far the consumer is from a, quote, normal population. These validity scales are used in conjunction with the other scales to determine if there is some reason for unusual responses, such as when psychosis appears to be present, or in the absence of serious psychopathology, the consumer may be attempting to fake good or bad. Higher order scales. Emotional internalizing dysfunction, problems associated with mood and affect. Thought dysfunction, problems associated with disordered thinking. Behavioral externalizing dysfunction, problems associated with under-controlled behavior. These three higher order dimensions emerge from a factor analysis of the items demarcating clinically important individual variations in basic domains of affect, thought, and action. The emotional internalizing dysfunction scale shows evidence of risk for depressive disorder. The thought dysfunction scale assesses a broad range of difficulties associated with thought dysfunction, usually associated with schizophrenia. And behavior externalizing dysfunction assesses a broad range of behavior problems such as acting out. Restructured clinical scales. These are identical to the MMPI-2 RC scales. RCD, demoralization, general unhappiness and dissatisfaction. RC1, somatic complaints, diffuse physical health complaints. RC2, low positive emotions, lack of positive emotional responsiveness. RC3, cynicism, non-self-referential beliefs expressing distrust and generally low opinion of others. RC4, antisocial behavior, rule-breaking and irresponsible behavior. The restructured clinical scales are reworkings of the basic scales for the MMPI-2 so that each scale does not overlap so much with the other scales. In the revised format of the MMPI-2, these take the place of the basic scales that we had seen earlier. Also, the descriptions of each scale are more accurate than the descriptors for the basic scales, which could be thought of as historical artifacts. RC6, ideas of persecution, self-referential beliefs that others pose a threat. RC7, dysfunctional negative emotions, maladaptive anxiety, anger, and irritability. RC8, aberrant experiences, unusual perceptions or thoughts. RC9, hypomanic activation, overactivation, aggression, impulsivity, and grandiosity. The restructured clinical scales are used in conjunction with the other scales to determine the meaning of high scores when they appear. Somatic cognitive scales. Malaise, an overall sense of physical debilitation and poor health. Gastrointestinal complaints, nausea, recurring upset stomach, and poor appetite. Head pain complaints, head and neck pain. Neurological complaints, dizziness, weakness, paralysis, loss of balance, etc. Cognitive complaints, memory problems and difficulties concentrating. The somatic cognitive scales are genuine experiences of distressing impairment in the consumer, even though the somatic symptoms reported cannot be explained by a medical condition. The intent of these scales is to identify persons with physical symptoms that are caused by psychological causes rather than medical causes. Looking at these scales, one should be aware that many consumers have real disabilities as well as psychological issues about those disabilities. Internalizing scales. Suicidal death ideation. Direct reports of suicidal ideation and recent attempts. Helplessness, hopelessness. Belief that goals cannot be reached or problems solved. Self-doubt. Lack of confidence, feelings of uselessness. Inefficacy. Belief that one is indecisive and inefficacious. These 9 internalizing scales measure aspects of the RC scales, demoralization and dysfunctional negative emotion scales. Internalizing scales. Stress and worry, preoccupation with disappointments, difficulty with time pressure. Anxiety, pervasive anxiety, frights, frequent nightmares. Anger proneness, becoming easily angered, impatient with others. Behavior restricting fears, fears that significantly inhibit normal behavior. Multiple specific fears, fears regarding things or situations in the environment. Externalizing scales, these are facets of the RC4. Juvenile conduct problems, difficulties at school, at home, and stealing. Substance abuse, current and past misuse of alcohol and drugs. Facets of the RC9 are aggression, which is physically aggressive and violent behavior. Activation, heightened excitation and energy level. Interpersonal, family problems, conflictual family relationships. Interpersonal passivity, being unassertive and submissive. Social avoidance, avoiding or not enjoying social events. Shyness, bashful, prone to feeling inhibited and anxious around others. Disaffiliativeness, disliking people and being around them. These scales would give some information regarding the consumer's ability to deal socially with people in the workplace. Interest scales. Aesthetic literary interests, literature, music, and the theater. Mechanical physical interests, fixing and building things, the outdoors, and sports. These interest scales are very much like the Holland vocational interest types, artistic and realistic, which we will go into in depth in another class. Psi-5, Personality Psychopathology 5 Scales Revised. Aggressiveness revised, instrumental goal-directed aggression. Psychoticism revised, disconnection from reality. Disconstraint revised, under-controlled behavior. Negative emotionality, neuroticism revised. Anxiety, insecurity, worry, and fear. Introversion, low positive emotionality revised. Social disengagement and anhedonia. These scales should not be confused with the Big 5 personality scales we'll be talking about in the next few slides. These are all issues that might be present in persons with a diagnosable disorder. The completion of the MMPI-2RF required the adoption of the revised version of the Psi-5 by Harkness and McNulty. The Psi-5 scales are related to DSM clusters A, B, and C of the personality disorders. The NEO Personality Inventory uses the Big 5 personality traits, and your memnotic to remember those is ocean or canoe. Openness or broad interests and imaginative. Conscientiousness, organized and high standards. Extroversion, outgoing, active, and high-spirited. Agreeableness, good-natured, cooperative. And neuroticism, fear, sadness, anger, and guilt. These can be self-report or observer ratings. The NEO personality inventories comprise a series of closely related interests which evolved over 30 years of research on the original NEO inventory. Since 1985, inventories have also included 2 other dimensions of agreeableness and conscientiousness to openness, conscientiousness, and neuroticism, which is the NEO mentioned in NEO personality inventory. Open individuals are more likely to choose artistic occupations, have a wide interest in a variety of occupations, and may be midlife career changers. Extroverted individuals may show skills in dealing with people, such as in sales. Neurotic individuals may be likely to be dissatisfied in whatever job they perform. And conscientious persons would be good in jobs that require intense, sustained efforts as well as high aspiration levels. NEO4 implications can give a sense of how an individual might function in a number of areas, including coping and defenses, somatic complaints, psychological well-being, cognitive processes, and needs and motives. Coping and defenses looks at how a person copes with the stresses of everyday life, making affective responses, hostile reactions toward others, self-blame, and escapist fantasies. Somatic complaints taps how a person reacts to physical problems and illness, exaggerating or minimizing physical symptoms, and objectivity in assessing seriousness of medical problems. Psychological well-being includes mood, positive and negative feelings, and general contentment with life. Cognitive processes assess the complexity of thoughts, values, and moral judgments, as well as the level of intelligence and education and original problem solving and creativity. Needs and motives looks at needs for affiliation, harm avoidance, nurturance, as well as abasement, change, and play. Facets of openness: fantasy, aesthetics, feelings, actions, ideas, and values. All of these facets of the larger category openness are actually subscales of openness. The openness domain measures responses to various kinds of experiences. Low scorers are down to earth and conventional. They prefer the familiar and the tried and true. High scorers are imaginative and open-minded. They're open individuals who are curious about both the inner and outer worlds, and their lives are experientially richer than those of closed individuals, and they're willing to entertain novel ideas and unconventional values, and experience both positive and negative emotions more keenly than do closed individuals. Openness may sound healthier and more mature, but to many psychologists, the value of openness or closedness depends on the requirements of the situation. Both open and closed individuals perform useful functions in society. Conscientiousness facets: competence, order, dutifulness, achievement striving, self-discipline, and deliberation. Traits in the conscientiousness domain describe differences in motivation and persistence. Low scorers are easygoing and not inclined to make plans or schedules. High scorers are conscientious and well organized. The conscientious individual is purposeful, strong-willed, and determined, and probably few people become great decision makers or athletes without a reasonably high level of this trait. On the positive high side of conscientiousness is associated with academic and occupational achievement. On the negative side, it may lead to annoying fastidiousness, compulsive neatness, or workaholic behavior. Extroversion facets: warmth, gregariousness, assertiveness, activity, excitement seeking, and positive emotions. The extroversion domain measures traits related to energy and enthusiasms, especially when dealing with people. Low scorers are serious and introverted, and high scorers are outgoing extroverts. In addition to liking people and preferring large groups and gatherings, extroverts are also assertive, active, and talkative. And although it's easy to convey the characteristics of the extrovert, the introvert is less easy to portray. In some respect, introversion should be seen as the absence of extroversion rather than being assumed to be its opposite. Thus, introverts are reserved rather than unfriendly, independent rather than followers, and work at an even pace rather than being sluggish. And they do not necessarily suffer from social anxiety. Agreeableness facets. Trust, straightforwardness, altruism, compliance, modesty, and tender-mindedness. The agreeableness domain is concerned with styles of interpersonal interaction. Low scorers are hard-headed and competitive, and high scorers are compassionate and cooperative. The agreeable person is fundamentally altruistic. They are sympathetic to others and eager to help, and believe that others would be equally helpful in return. It's tempting to see the agreeable side of the domain as being socially preferable and psychologically healthier, and it is certainly the case that agreeable people are more popular than antagonistic individuals. However, the readiness to fight for one's own interests is often advantageous, and agreeableness is not a virtue on the battlefield or in the courtroom. Skeptical and critical thinking contributes to accurate analysis in the sciences. Neuroticism facets. Anxiety, angry hostility, depression, self-consciousness, impulsiveness, and vulnerability. Just to avoid some confusion, neuroticism is not one of the traits that's covered in the assessment, the NEO4. I'm including this just as an addendum for the other NEO assessments that does include neuroticism, but that are not necessarily vocational in nature. Traits in the neuroticism domain reflect different ways of reacting emotionally to distressing circumstances. Low scorers are resilient, rarely experiencing negative emotions, and high scorers often have strong emotional reactions. The most pervasive domain of personality scales contrasts adjustment or emotional stability with maladjustment or neuroticism. The general tendency to experience negative aspects such as fear, sadness, embarrassment, anger, guilt, and disgust is at the core of the N domain. High scorers may be at risk for some kind of psychiatric problem, but it is possible to obtain a high score on the N scale without having any diagnosable psychiatric disorder. Low scorers are usually calm, even-tempered, and relaxed, and they're able to face stressful situations without becoming upset or rattled. The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, developed by a mother-daughter team of psychologists to operationalize Jung's concepts. The MBTI provides 4 pairs of scales that are dichotomous in nature: extroversion versus introversion, sensing versus intuition, thinking versus feeling, and judgment versus perception. The MBTI scales use names that are labels rather than what the words typically mean. It can be thought of as a test of preferences. It's used for couples counseling, corporate retreats, and other situations in which individual differences can be discussed in a non-threatening manner. Knowledge of these preferences can be used to discuss work situations in which the consumer would feel comfortable. This is a table that includes all the various possibilities of the 4 dichotomous pairs of traits. The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator report form gives a brief synopsis of each 4-letter type. As an example, here's a description for an ISTJ, which is in the top left corner. Serious, quiet, earns success by concentration and thoroughness. Practical, orderly, matter-of-fact, logical, realistic, and dependable. See to it that everything is well organized. Take responsibility. Make up their own minds as to what should be accomplished and work toward it steadily, regardless of protests or distractions. Extroversion versus introversion. How you focus your attention. Extroversion. Focus energy, understand their world, and process information externally by talking and acting. Ask questions and think out loud during activities and while working through a decision. Learns and works best when able to share, discuss, and process information with others. Introversion. Focus energy and process information internally through reflection and introspection, tend to think before they speak or act, learns and works best by having time to understand and process information on their own. Of all the pairs, this is the easiest for the consumer to acknowledge, and which side the consumer is on will be obvious to you after speaking with the consumer. There are some occupations that are more suited to one side or the other. In occupations where the consumer is dealing with only one person at a time, however, such as rehabilitation counseling, either an introvert or an extrovert could be successful. Sensing versus intuition, how you process information. Sensing. Focus on individual facts and details before seeing underlying patterns or whole concepts. Prefer information and tasks that are organized and presented in an orderly, sequential format. Are most interested in facts as they are known now. Intuition. Focus on what facts mean and how they fit together, paying attention to implications, possibilities, and relationships between ideas rather than facts and details alone. Like solving problems and developing new skills. They jump around between ideas and tasks as they work and learn. Thinking versus feeling, how you make decisions. Thinking. Focuses on logic and analysis. Deals best with objective data and cause and effect relationships. Understands emotions and feels best when they are introduced as facts and details to consider in decision making and problem solving. Feeling. Are more interested in the effects of information on people than in the things or ideas themselves. See the atmosphere at work as being as important as the work itself. Make objective decisions and are good at understanding and appreciating the values of others. Judging versus perceiving, how you interact with the world. Judging. Makes decisions as soon as possible to have closure. Plan and organize their world. Like roles and expectations to be clear and definite. Are uncomfortable with change and ambiguity. Perceiving. Defer judgments to gather more information. Prefer starting projects to following through with them. Are flexible and adaptable. Focus on exploring and seeking new information and embrace change. The 16 Personality Factor Questionnaire, or the 16PF. The 16 Personality Factor Questionnaire is a comprehensive measure of normal range personality found to be effective in a variety of settings where an in-depth assessment of the whole person is needed. It's a multi-level measure of personality based on Cattell's factor analytic theory, providing the most basic definition of individual personality differences. The manual for the 16PF also gives occupational titles and the level of match given particular scores. This is a very busy table of 16PF primary and global scales. Extroversion, introversion. A, warm versus reserved. F, lively versus serious. H, bold versus shy. N, private versus forthright. Q2, self-reliant versus group-oriented. So you should notice by now that the descriptions of personalities given across tests are very similar in many cases. So extroversion and introversion are very similar to the concepts as presented in the Myers-Briggs type indicator. High anxiety versus low anxiety. C, emotionally stable versus reactive. L, vigilant versus trusting. O, apprehensive versus self-assured. Q4, tense versus relaxed. Tough-mindedness versus receptivity. A, warmness versus reserved. I, sensitive versus unsentimental. M, abstracted versus practical. Q1, open to change versus traditional. Independence versus accommodation. E, dominant versus deferential. H, bold versus shy. L, vigilant versus trusting. Q1, open to change versus traditional. Self-control versus lack of restraint. F, lively versus serious. G, rule-conscious versus expedient. M, abstracted versus practical. Q3, perfectionistic versus tolerates disorder. The Employability Maturity Interview. The Employability Maturity Interview is a 10-item structured interview developed to assess readiness for the vocational rehabilitation planning process and the need for additional vocational exploration and employability services. The items deal with occupational choice, self-appraisal of abilities, self-appraisal of personality characteristics, and orientation to work. The Rosenberg Self-Esteem Scale. The scale is a 10-item Likert scale with items answered on a 4-point scale from strongly agree to strongly disagree. The original sample for the scale was developed and consisted of 5,024 high school juniors and seniors from 10 randomly selected schools in New York State. Rotter's locus of control. Internal. I control the consequences of my behavior, which results in better academic achievement, better interpersonal relations, greater efforts to learn, positive attitudes to exercise, lower cigarette smoking, lower hypertension and heart attacks. External. The consequences of my behavior are out of my control, which results in more resigned to conditions as they are, lower efforts to deal with health, lower levels of psychological adjustment, but in non-responsive environments, a greater sense of satisfaction. And this is the end of the Week 10 lecture.